everybody. So, uh, I have a few house announcements or class announcements, or however you want to put it, which I'll iterate both now and as we get further into the office hour because people tend to join late, up until the end of the meeting. So, the first one is we've had a number of students asking if the course will be continue to be made available even after the end of this week, and the answer is yes. So all the materials will be available for at least another 3 weeks, maybe a month after this Sunday. So if you've found the material a bit thick to get through and you need a bit more time to finish it in order to receive the certificate of completion, not to worry, it'll be available for at least another 3 weeks past this Sunday. The next announcement is that my interview with John Keefe, which is about 20 minutes long, has been uploaded. It's available both in weeks 3 and 4. So originally it was only available in week three. So I think some people may have missed it. It's now available also in week 4. And the interview with Freddie Bolton will be up by the end of today as well. So we have two interviews. We have just now another email went out for Module 4's Collaboratory link. So if you use Google Collaboratory last week, another Collaboratory link is being made available for this week. And uh, because it's very important, I'll just repeat it. The materials for this class will continue to be available for another 3 weeks. So if you need extra time to finish all the material in order to receive the certificate of completion, it will be made available. So um, with that, uh, hello, welcome to the last week of the class. Uh, I guess now my beginning of the week message and my midweek messages have both gone out. Uh, my lecture material has been made available online, and we've been chatting on the forums already. But regardless, welcome to the last week of this class. It's been nearly a month now. I hope you've been finding it helpful. I hope you've been finding it useful. And if not, that's what the office hour is for. So feel free to chime in at any point to ask questions if you have them. Otherwise, I'm going to be demoing, I think, a few useful things that one can do with what we've learned so far in this class. So at any point, feel free to unmute and just ask questions out loud, interrupt me. I don't. Yes, Sharon. What's up?
Yeah, I don't know if it's beyond the scope of the class, but I really need links to the source materials in an RIG journalist focused application. And I don't know if that's possible to do with Gradio easily, if it's possible to find
Mm,
some example to do that we could follow. That's
sure.
that's my that's my that's my first need in order to like use this. And the second one is
Hmm.
I don't know why that agent is running so incredibly slowly for me when everything else that I'm doing is not. I don't know if it's because of the agent, but I mean when I use the LM directly in the code, it's fine. So it's
Hmm.
not that like I'm running the thing on my computer. I don't know if it's the agent or what. And that maybe you can't answer, but if you could address the link issue, that would be awesome.
Yeah, so regarding performance, it's incredibly stochastic. Sometimes it runs perfectly for me. It answers within a couple of seconds. Sometimes it takes a while. My sense is that LangChain in particular, for whatever reason, doesn't drive well with Mistral's particular instruction tuning. So that I have to look more into. But regarding linking. So with source linking, LangChain has this thing, I'm not sure if you're aware of it. Uh, you can access intermediate steps. So what that means is that in the middle of the call, so when the agent decides to use a tool and the tool returns with some sort of information, we can actually look at what precisely that tool did to produce that information. So what this means is that in the middle of the agent using a tool, we can capture all of the documents that were recorded. We can capture all of the documents that were accessed and used to answer a particular question. And if we can't, for whatever reason, have the model cite it itself, because that's usually the best way to do it. I know Bing Chat, I think they stick it into the prompt for Bing Chat to tell it to cite, and it's the same thing with Bard. But if for whatever reason prompting to tell the model to cite its information doesn't work, then accessing intermediate steps is the next best solution. And it's quite good that LangChain produces that. So when the model is accessing tools to answer your question. It goes through a action, input, observation, thought process. It's a loop. It's called React. It's from a paper last year, um, where the idea is that you have the model describe its thought process verbally. So when the model decides to do something, when the model decides to use a tool and access the information and look at the results of that tool and answer a question based off of that retrieved information, what we can do is we can simply capture what's happened. And if you want to cite information on the back end, I think there's a way for intermediate steps to show which documents are accessed. So if you look at which documents are accessed, you can actually uh, just link to it separately, not in the model's actual response, but somehow after the fact. So after the model responds, you might be able to just print out the document, uh, the section of the document and which document in particular it is. So that's my best sense for how to get the model to cite its own information. Um, you always have this
Kind of,
problem where if the model itself isn't the one citing the information, it might be accessing the document, but it might not actually be using the document to answer the question. So in such a situation, then trying to get the model to cite its own information through prompting is probably the best response. Sorry, Alyssa. My bad.
oh yeah, I was just gonna say, I think conceptually sometimes I worry that um, I would be asking the model a question of my
Mhm.
data and getting a response, but then getting the response also requires me to have to go back and make sure that the response is true, right? Like it's,
Yeah.
and so it's like, okay, well then is, I mean, this is a conceptual question. This is like a broader idea, especially
Mhm.
when I think about it, like in my newsroom, like, is
Mhm.
that worth it? Or is it best for me to just scratch all that and just like go through the steps very methodically myself? I mean, in some ways, having it as like as a, another, check is helpful, but how much do I
Mhm.
trust the response when I say, what zip code do most people live in? And it gives me a response like, don't I have to also go back and fact check that?
You do. So the unfortunate answer
Right.
is
Okay.
you
Yeah.
do.
Okay.
There's ways to get the model to. I think some organizations are beginning to research ways to really look at what the model was thinking of when it gave a certain response. But at the end of the day, these models work because they are stochastic. It's what allows them to respond to questions. It's what allows them to handle situations that I wasn't necessarily trained for. But the stochasticity is also its Achilles heel. So if you want to integrate a language model into your workflow in some regard, it's probably better to limit it to situations where it's actually you wouldn't have to fact check. And one example would be, so in John Keefe's interview, we're talking about having language models predict. So his example is you have say like a million documents, and you want to know uh, which of the million documents are legal documents in particular, and it might be like a whole bunch of transcripts and might be a whole bunch of like financial documents and then legal documents and what have you. And you only want a particular set of legal documents and maybe only ones that have to do with like land ownership or something. What you can do, and I kind of demonstrated this last week in the office hour, but I need to zoom in here. What you can do is you can present every single document. Oh, I didn't. Let's see. What you can do is you can present every single document to the language model and have it classify the document. And so the nice thing about language models versus older predictive machine learning models is you used to have a whole bunch of legal documents, mark them as legal documents, and then train a machine learning model from scratch to only be able to identify that particular kind of legal document. But papers and natural language texts are really, they can vary so much in their semantics and their syntax, and they might be conceptually all the same group, but it might be really difficult for a model in particular to figure that out unless it can actually read natural language. And so language models, large language models, here you don't need to fact check them so much because you're going to be running this model through some sort of training and testing step. Like you are, if the model 85% of the time is correct in identifying legal documents, if you constrain the model just so, and you can constrain the model from a uh, with a variety of strategies, but one of them is to limit the temperature. Um, Temperature is a fun little knob that you can turn on language models. It goes between 0 to 1. Normally, you can go above 1, but what it does is temperature is sometimes known as like the creativity value. So if you set a temperature to 0, language models tend to always pick the most probable next token without fail. And what ends up happening when you always pick the most probable token or word is you get really boring text and it reads almost like legalese coming out of this thing. And when you turn up the knob and the model begins picking uh, terms that are a little bit less uh, likely, suddenly it gets interesting. And for some reason, humans, it's a neurolinguistic property where if we read text that contains text that we don't predict, that we find unexpected, that we are unexpecting of, we suddenly perceive that whole text as being more creative and actually better in a sense. So if you turn the temperature down, it hurts the model's ability to write coherently, cogently, but it makes it better at classification tasks. So if you have a model that's doing good classification tasks, you can reasonably trust its output without verifying every single classification. On the other hand, when you're having it read like a million documents and trying to synthesize some sort of output, yeah, you definitely do need a human in there at some point. Um, I had the pleasure of speaking a few times to the former head of curation at Twitter. She was asked by Elon Musk. When she joined Twitter, her role was setting up something she called human in the loop, which is this idea that you can automate 95% of your whole production pipeline, but at the final 5%, you're always going to want a person looking at the output no matter what. And I think even with better language models coming out, we're still are not really going to be able to get around that fact that people do need to be in the pipeline at some point. So if you have a really complicated pyramid that you've like a house of cards that you've constructed with LangChain, and you don't have the manpower to be able to sit down and just look at it and determine if it's working or not, you might be running into issues down the road. So while this course was looking at using language models for retrieval augmented generation, in general, even in my own work, I typically really only use language models for structuring unstructured information. So if I have a bunch of random pieces of documents, I can turn every single one into like a predetermined set of like several attributes, and it's like complexity of text or entities in the text or emotions in the text, and just like a list of them. So
It's
structuring
almost
unstructured
like
information is very useful. Yeah,
it's almost like you're using the model to like create very personalized tags for each document.
totally. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
They're excellent at
Okay.
that. And
Yeah. And I can see how that
if
would
you
be
have some,
useful when you gave the example of like you have a million documents and you're trying to find the legal documents that pertain to property as opposed to the legal
mm,
documents that pertain to like, you know, uh, I don't know,
I don't know,
assets
like
or something like that.
panels or
I don't
something.
know. That's
Yeah,
like a form, but yeah, like some other you can kind of be pointed in the right direction by getting documents that match that framework. I think that
yeah,
helps me
totally,
understand like a practical application for this, where yes, I still as a human still need to be involved in it, but it would certainly help speed up the process a lot.
totally,
Yeah. Okay.
totally, totally,
Cool.
totally.
Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Uh, and so whenever I'm doing consulting or I'm helping out, it's usually in the metadata and annotation process. And even as my research as a graduate student, it's very often like, here are 10,000 novels. Can we go through every single novel and pick out every single time a character is thinking? Because we don't quite understand what the rate of thinking is in certain kinds of novels from certain time periods. And if that's like a classic literary studies approach, but the general philosophy of using language models to annotate is really where things are, I think, still right now. And it's actually a little bit of a under-realized niche, believe it or not. People get very focused on ChatGPT, people get very focused on agents, but that's not really their strong suit. And I think even in the kind of demo project we've built over this course, we found that the tech is still not quite there yet, which is a bit of a strange outcome of the course, maybe. But I found it was useful just for myself to actually get a look at where LangChain is gone nowadays, and the answer is not very far.
So you
So
could see this like assigning taxonomy and category tags to articles maybe as a useful newsroom application.
yeah, totally. So the other one is just like searching. So for example, I have a project that I've been helping out with that's like a collection of short stories. So we've manually annotated 5,000 short stories that have been released over the last, such and such time. And for our search, I wasn't sure how to do search because we wanted to be able to handle situations where somebody could type in very specific, uh, like stories where someone like drives a car or something. Like we wanted to be able to handle really semantically ambiguous search terms because classic search technologies like Elasticsearch, they still pattern match. They still look for specific words and see if those words appear in the tags for a document. But that's not really interesting. And in particular, even in this course, we've been using something called sentence transformers, uh, which is, where's a demonstration? They have a really nice explanation of it somewhere. Maybe it's here. No. So sentence transformers, we've been using this in the class. It's the idea of doing semantic search where you type in a query and you try to get all relevant queries, which is literally defined by uh, this space of meaning and how close two documents are in the space of meaning. And two documents are close in this space of meaning, not because they share words, but because they share the same meaning. And language models are able to provide us this sense of meaning because I can type in something very strange and vague into ChatGPT, and it can usually understand what I mean, even if the words I've typed in have never like occurred before in the history of English or any language. So on the back end, I just hooked it up to semantic search. It was like I think 5 lines of code to import a model. There's a language model that runs in real time when I hit search on this website. And it makes it a little bit slow, but it's able to rank every website, every short story we have on the site. And so stories where someone drives a car, you get stories about cars at the very beginning. But you can also handle searches like Murakami, and you get Murakami coming up the front end. So with this website, we've been annotating short stories manually, but that's because writers in general don't want their story hitting a language model for any purpose. And if you're working in a newsroom, I've no doubt that people are probably a little bit more willing to feed their articles through a language model if they know that the language model is A, running on servers that they control, and they know that their data isn't being used for training. And so using a language model to produce those classifications is, I think, quite useful. This is kind of complicated, but one issue that I've run into with using language models for annotation is sometimes the language model refuses to annotate, or it will like just like a cooking recipe on the internet, it will have like say like 1,000 words before it gives you the annotation. And the question there is how do you get around that? The answer is you can use something called a grammar, which you can only do if you run language models on your own computer. And like semantic structure of a sentence, just like a Noam Chomsky, a famous linguist in the 1950s, came up with this like idea of parsing a sentence down into its constituent parts. So like I saw him when she called me, and then that like this is a noun and this is a verb, and then this is a noun again, and so on. You can force the language model to only output, for example, chess moves, or force it to only output lists, or only output valid JSON, for example. And so I use this together with language models to have a pretty good classification model that doesn't require training. You only have to test to make sure it works. But once you have a functioning prompt, it's good for pretty much ever. Uh, and so, yeah, annotating documents is the one use case I've personally found where language models continue to be very useful. And I think John Keefe also reiterates that in his own interview. Of course, he's weather data editor at the Times. He does a lot of work with mapping, but I think he references Quartz or something like the previous job he worked at, where they did a lot of machine learning work in modeling and annotating documents, and some of that can be sped up, honestly speaking, with language models nowadays.
Question
Um,
about
Sure.
semantic, you mentioned like semantic structure. Um,
Hmm.
I'm a neuroscience journalist. I spend most of my time reading science
Oh, cool.
papers. Do you,
Uh-huh.
do you recommend Semantic Scholar perhaps as like a
Yeah,
method
that's
of
but
have you
a method
used
for what? Sorry.
just for like finding like essentially querying papers and finding like the most relevant papers. I had only as opposed to like
Mm,
Google Scholar or PubMed or like just typing
mm,
in Google like papers related to Alzheimer's. You know, I guess have you heard of any of these types of um like
mhm.
semantic searching when it relates to science papers?
Yeah, so semantic search, I think in the background is just doing this.
Hmm.
Um, I still use Google Scholar,
You still use
just
Google
because I think
Scholar,
I'm
okay.
just yeah, because I'm
Yeah.
just used to it. But uh, typically I find that applications that do use semantic search, and I think actually the AP is using it now. Is it AP.com? Did I get that wrong? Oh, it's not org. Oops. So I think the AP has some kind of semantic search thing going on now. Relevance. Yeah, I know the information does. So if you go to the information nowadays and try to search something
Mhm.
up, um, they give you a really big warning. The search might not work properly, but in fact,
It's
uh,
like more
it's
accurate.
it's using semantic search in the background. Semantically accurate, yeah, it would be the word that I would
Mm.
use.
Mm.
Um, so it's the same
I'm
thing
just
with
curious
semantic
to know
scholar.
if you like what you think about. I don't know if you had run across Semantic
I
Scholar.
think what's nice about semantic scholar is they do back references. So if you click on a particular article, it'll tell you what articles that have cited this article have also cited. And generally, when I'm trying to get a lay of the land, either I go to someone's very particular Google Scholar profile, just because I'm concerned with
Mhm.
specific professors, or I look at back references on Semantic Scholar. Those two tend to be the most interesting routes for research,
Okay,
researching
so you do use
documents.
Semantic Scholar, but
Yeah,
just
I do.
but when it comes to like okay, all right,
Yeah.
cool.
But I think my point more so within the context of this course is that it's using something
Hmm.
like semantic search in the background, and
Right,
it's very
exactly.
simple to set up. And that's like the big benefit of a language model is that you can achieve these
Yeah.
tools or these use cases pretty simply.
Hmm.
Um,
Our dev team is like building our search feature right now, and I'm not involved in it at all, but I'm very curious about if they're using uh semantic search.
yeah, uh, that's a good question to ask, honestly.
Yeah.
I do think that Elasticsearch is now changing the way that they work. So this used to be pretty much like this is if you're running search on your website, it tends to be that you use Elasticsearch. And I think it does, yeah, so of course they now integrate semantic search into their protocol and you can weight it. So if you return results, 70% of the reason why a particular document is returned is because it's semantically on point, but then 30% you could say is also returned because of um, like actual words appearing in the document. Because one issue that we've run into on our website, even when we do look up things like Murakami, we used to not actually get Murakami stories returned. We would get stories that seem like they could have been written by Murakami from a semantic point of view, which is a little bit like that's missing the point of really why we want to have certain stories returned. But the solution there ended up being we just found like a very particular language model that did very well in a very small compressed amount of memory. So I think this model is only something like it's kind of tiny, 134 megabytes. So you can run it on pretty much any computer that's newer than say like 12 years old, and it'll run in real time. And the unfortunate thing here is that it only supports English and Chinese. And this is becoming a bit of a recurring case with certain language models. You've got Yi, which came out a couple of years ago, a couple of months ago. No, 1 month ago now. These things move really fast. They came out a month ago. It supports English and Chinese. And even if you look at Mistral, the Mistral just had a new model that came out the other day. Officially, they only support English, French, Italian, German, and Spanish. And This makes sense considering it's a French company, and it's a little bit like this older model called Bloom, which was trained on a supercomputer in France. It was purported to support 59 languages, but they didn't give the model enough examples of any of these 59 languages. So it came out not being able to speak any of them. It could speak every language to a proficiency of like a 2 or 3 year old or something. It was awful. So just like I found with this particular semantic search model, Mistral's new model, it probably can speak a whole bunch of languages, but the issue is that can it speak any of them well? If it doesn't officially support it, then you just don't know. And here again, you need to be having someone actually verifying the output of the model. So for everybody who's just joined, I've got a couple of announcements. The first is that if you're not close to completing the course, not to worry, because the course content will continue to be online for another 3 to 4 weeks. So if you do need time to complete the material in order to receive the certificate of completion, you will be able to access this for another 3 weeks. My interview with Freddie Bolton was just put up today. So there's that. And then John Keefe's interview was put up at the beginning of the week, and they're both available in Module 4. I had quite a bit of fun doing those interviews, in particular with John, just because he gave a sense of how he figures language models will fit into newsrooms moving into the future. I think adding a different voice to the course material. So yes, we've got a question in the chat. Alyssa is leaving. Okay, thank you very much for joining. So I think a word then on this model. So I think this model was reported on at least by The Guardian, so there's been some media attention on it. It's an important model in the sense that it's an upgraded version of the model we've been using in this course. So we've been using Mistral 7 billion parameters for the past 3 weeks. And this model is better, but it's not very much bigger. So it's a bit of an achievement in the sense that it's about as good as ChatGPT. So if you're able to use ChatGPT and you like how it talks and you find Mistral to be a little bit less intelligent than you prefer, then Mixtral, 8 times 7 billion, is quite an important achievement in the open source community. And so I've been playing around with it since it was released on Friday in a tweet. They dropped a torrent link to download it without any commentary on Friday, and lots of people were suddenly using it. It was a bit of a shock to people who play around with language models, because here was a very good model using a new architecture that people haven't really played with before in the open source community. But there was no instructions on using it, so quite a number of people were spending time just trying to figure out how to run it. And I have it running on my laptop. It's quite slow, but it seems to work, which is actually impressive. And if you look at the benchmarks and yada yada yada, it's supposed to be very good. So one thing that I'll be playing around with this week is hooking it up to our notebook and seeing if it changes the way the notebook works and see if it makes it better, etc. But I think to pick up the previous trend of thought, annotating documents continues to be the raison d'etre for these models. It's the reason to use these models. And it is interesting to hook up your newsroom information to a model in order to be able to talk to your data, so to speak. But is that really a killer feature? No, not exactly. I mean, I could personally, first of all, these models get facts wrong all the time, even when you give them the information they need. So they can choose not to read the information that you give them, the sources you provide, etc. And they can choose to simply get it wrong and rely on their own memory. And even OpenAI has been having issues with this. I've been running into funny issues with ChatGPT, where if I want ChatGPT to, for example, I was asking it, I was eating this, you know what, I'm gonna forget the name of this. I was eating it's like a shrimp. You have it with nasi goreng. It's like a clapot. I don't know. It's like a shrimp cracker. I forget the name of it in Dutch and in English, of course. And it was very good, and I wanted to know what the name of this chip was in a whole bunch of different languages. And so I asked ChatGPT, which It used to be if you asked it for a translation, it would just tell you because it knows a whole bunch of languages. It's fluent in a whole bunch, even if they claim it isn't. It didn't do that. It decided to Bing search my question instead, and then read out the first web page it received, and those answers were wrong. So because it wasn't the actual word that I wanted, I think it was a homophone, which is unfortunate. So language models don't really have a sense of when to use the tools that we give them or when it's most appropriate, partly because this isn't natural to them. This idea of using a tool to answer a question is something that only began happening when we had language models. And if you remember how language models work, they can only really do what they see on the internet. And if there are no examples of using tools on the internet, then you have this chicken and egg problem where the language model might not necessarily know how to achieve the thing that you're asking of it because it is only it is the only thing that is capable of achieving that thing. Back when ChatGPT came out, I had a question, and that was ChatGPT, in a sense, is role playing, right? It pretends to be ChatGPT. In the prompt that OpenAI gives it, they give the model the personality of ChatGPT. But an interesting thing is that ChatGPT calls itself an AI and calls itself a language model. And I was wondering where that personality is coming from, because if they're telling ChatGPT to pretend to be a language model, um, that's kind of strange because then it has to rely on its own preconception of what it means to be a language model in order to play out that role. What does it mean to be a language model? Because ChatGPT was really the first kind of like semi-sentient chatbot that we've had. There is no chatbot language model that existed before ChatGPT. So my question was, where was that personality coming from? And nobody really had an answer. I think I talked to some guy who used to run a subreddit where he had chatbots talk to each other, and his sense was that it was just drawing on a general understanding of what it means to be an AI, which is fair. But as we're seeing, Ars Technica, I think, had an article up last week saying that ChatGPT's answers have been getting more lethargic and shorter as we enter December. And its sense is that in general, around this time of year in the Northern Hemisphere, if it's winter, people suffer from seasonal depression and their responses tend to get shorter. So if ChatGPT thinks it's December, it's going to mimic seasonal depression, which is very interesting. Um, and a little bit unfortunate, especially when we want to be able to rely on these models to give accurate answers. So whether that's true or not, I'm not sure. It kind of rings true, honestly speaking, using these models a lot. And so I think that only reinforces my notion that we should be looking at smarter uses of these tools, and whether that's annotation, whether that's semantic search. There are situations where I think language models can be game changers, where they can drive a lot of value, but retrieval augmented generation is probably not one of those so far. It might be the case that models get way, way better, and suddenly they are capable of looking up the internet, only when it's super necessary, but we're not there yet. So, from David, the quick administration module. Yes. So, I gave this announcement at the beginning of the session, so I apologize.
Yeah.
The material will be available for 3 more weeks, starting this Sunday.
Okay, so we're still good for another 3 weeks, and then so we have that time to kind of finish it up. Okay, perfect. Yeah, I got hit with work.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm going through all the material as much as the optional material as possible. I found myself falling a little behind, so just
No, yeah, it's quite heavy at the same time, and I apologize for the ramp up and difficulty. I had a difficult time adjusting the curve. But at least 3 more weeks, the material will be up. Yeah, for sure.
No, it's cool. It's cool.
Oh,
It's funny seeing how far Jupyter Notebook has progressed because I remember when I first started using it, there's just Jupyter Notebook, and then I was using Jupyter Lab, and now the Jupyter Desktop was new to me. I didn't realize they'd done that upgrade, so that was really cool. So yeah, it's super.
I had no idea either before this class. It's kind of like an unmentioned GitHub repository where you can download Jupyter Lab Desktop and have it run entirely within a container, and you don't have to do anything besides that. As soon as I saw that, I went, "Whoa! People could actually run a language model privately for the first time." But
Yeah, that's
um,
been the biggest thing. Like I went to if I've been looking into it because I'm in the college. I work for a college. I work for Humber actually. I know you're
mhm.
in Canada, so I'm at Humber College, and And
Cool.
yeah, and so it's you know, doing anything with ChatGPT is like our whole research department, all our legal team is like, you know, oh, you're gonna run Chat. I'm like, no, no, no. So being able to, for example, run these models locally, because we actually do have the hardware,
Mhm.
um, will be really cool. I think this gives a really good use case. So
Yeah.
yeah.
At McGill, we purchased a desktop for my lab. It was a Dell computer for $1,000 Canadian, which is not much in American, but it's a pretty sweet computer, and we've been looking at using it for annotation work locally. So instead of like depending on OpenAI for reproducible research, OpenAI and all of the online APIs are awful because they're constantly switching it around. They're deprecating the original GPT-3 model at the beginning of the year. There are so many papers that have been written on this model, and it will no longer be available, which is just horrendous. And they're not going to be making the weights available. They're not going to be able. They're not making any of it available. It will just be gone in the wind. And so. Uh, Local language models like Llama, like Mistral are exciting also just for reproducible research, if that's your interest, I think.
Yeah.
Or at least that's what I've been pitching my professor, so we'll see. My PI. Um, so there's another question coming in from Nico. You want to use the notebook that you uploaded. Uh, how private are the notebooks in Google? They're private to you. So if you do something in the link that I shared you and you open it up and you do something in this notebook, it will only be on your end that you will see any changes. It won't be shared with the rest of the class. That being said, I did turn on a privacy option when I shared it, and this privacy option makes it so that the model doesn't necessarily it makes it so the notebook forgets all the output, and it also forgets the environment. So if you drag and drop in files here, um, in order to have the model do retrieval augmented generation or on those files, as soon as you close the environment or you close the tab and you open it back up, or you have the environment open for 12 hours, it will forget all of those. It will forget that information. It will delete the environment. So that's problem number one. And the second one is that it will also, if you close the tab and open it back up, forget all of the output. And if you want to disable that, go to Edit and then Notebook Settings. And then under Notebook Settings, there's a cell down here, omit code cell output when saving this notebook. So I think if you take ownership, quote unquote, of this notebook, you can uncheck that. And if you want to, you can save a copy in Drive, which I think will make it yours. Oh, it's trying to open in a new tab, which is fine. Let's let it do that. Okay, so, and then you click up here, you can disable this in notebook settings, uncheck. There you go. So now everything that I do in here, everything that I do in this model, in this notebook, will be saved, so to speak, inside the notebook. Dum, dum, dum. Right. So this week in particular, if you look at the code blocks, I thought I would just make a little bit of a mention here. It looks quite small. There isn't that much uh, that I added for this week, and that's because Gradio itself is kind of like there's a lot to Gradio. There's quite a bit to running it, to booting it up. Well, once you have it going, it does pretty much everything user interfacey that you could imagine or that you might want. And if you want more information on what Gradio is capable of, there's a great example here that I was using. I'll paste it into the chat. They go through different ways of setting up a fancy front end chatbot interface, and then they have more information on the side. So if you want on the side, so if you want to uh, theme your document, uh, somewhere in the documentation there will be more specific information on theming, which I will share. So anyway, there's the link to that. So Nico's asking again, private in terms of sharing with sensible documents from the newsrooms. Yeah, so if you have sensitive information, do not drag and drop it into Google, because I don't think that's what anybody wants to do if they have sensitive information that they wouldn't necessarily want Google to know or to train on. Don't do that. Colaboratory, there's no promise of privacy from Google and Colaboratory simply because Google gives this away for free. So their sense is probably anything you give them is fair game in essence, because they're letting us use GPUs here, fairly good GPUs for free, just because they're not being used by Google. So they're giving us the margin. So no, Google Colaboratory is not private at all, which is a little bit unfortunate, honestly speaking. I think there is a private version of Colaboratory paper. Is it Paperweight notebook? No, I'm not going to be able to come up with this on the spot, but I think actually, you know what? I think Kaggle, those notebooks, I would expect Kaggle's notebooks to be safer, except they're also owned by Google, which is then a little bit strange. But I'll look for online notebook hosts that could be free because I know that there are a few that are machine learning specific, and I would expect those to be the most private. So anyway, just to reiterate my announcements from the beginning of this session, you can take up to 3 more weeks after Sunday to complete all the course materials to get the certificate of completion. So well into January, you'll be able to complete the course materials if you want to. Take your time. That's perfectly fine. Freddie's interview is coming up today, as is John's, which came up on Monday. Both are well worth watching, in my opinion, just simply because I think they deal more specifically with journalists in the newsroom, especially John's interview. And Freddie's is interesting because he gives a sense of what people are using Gradio for. In particular, if you want to have a machine learning proof of concept in your company, but it's a little bit unclear how much manpower you want to devote to such a project or how much budget there is even in the first place for an engineer. Gradio gives you the potential to figure something out on your own without actually having an engineer, something that's production quality. So with that, answer any final questions. Notable? Maybe it is notable. I'm gonna look it up actually after the session. Anyway, so with that, thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to continue to be in the forums. I'll do a pass through all the questions on the questions to the instructor section of the forum, which is filled up in the last few days. Thank you very much for taking this course. Really, it's been a pleasure, and it's been very interesting from my perspective to put together these documents because Amy Reinhardt and we did a previous course with about 10,000 people taking it, and it was very busy. It was lots of people were asking questions and talking in the forums, and it was busy, busy, busy. But at the end of it, we had a number of people who were wondering, how do I actually use the language model though? Because this course was the previous course was entitled how to use ChatGPT in the newsroom, and we didn't actually demonstrate that at all, which was partially a decision because it was a popular course with lots of people attending and many people who we couldn't assume had any previous experience with computers. So the idea was for me to do a second course diving a little bit more into actually how to use language models. And if nothing else, I hope that you do take away a sense of what language models are like in practice beyond the hype, because there's so many companies that put up puff pieces and hype pieces and talk about AI doing this and AI doing that. But really at the end of the day, they're word prediction tools. So which gets lost in translation with all that marketing on top. So thank you very much for taking it. I honestly really appreciate it. And I'll continue to be around in the forums, I think, even after the course finishes to answer questions. So for those who can't complete all the material, I will continue to be around. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a good day.